We see the world as a panorama all the time. That's our natural state. I can see my hands right now. I can't count my fingers because the resolution's not very good, but I know they're there. I like to work with this immersive, panoramic, experiential imagery. And it started with me, the first film I ever worked on was at Graphic Films in Hollywood, which was To the Moon and Beyond for the New York World's Fair in 1964, which was shot in this unusual fisheye, 10 perforation, 70 millimeter film process and projected into a planetarium dome. And Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw that film at the expo and called Graphic Films and said, you know, we want to make this movie, which became titled 2001: A Space Odyssey. And we started doing pre-production. When I first arrived at the movie I was already progressing. I was kind of coming on a little bit late. And the Centrifuge was under construction, the pod bay was under construction, all the sets were under construction. And here I am, this 23-year-old kid from LA with cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, which was kind of my look at the time. And they thought this was all just terribly cute. And I had just total freedom, which was part of the magic of being able to do what I wanted to do. And I was always having crazy ideas. And so I could just go over to the wood shop and say, well, could you guys make me a piece of plywood with a hole in it that will rotate? I'm going to mount this thing on it, and I'm going to be able to turn it to a bunch of different positions at an angle in an X-ray machine downtown London. And they said, oh yeah, fine, whatever, Doug, you know, I'll have it for you later. And so they would build things for me, and then I would be dispatched to the X-ray company in London in Stanley Kubrick's private Bentley. And everybody thought, well, whatever, you know. And I thought, well, this is amazing, you know. But that was kind of my life at that time. It was just having this incredible freedom to cross all boundaries and think laterally in many different ways and do a lot of very unusual things. And it's that kind of the art form, the interface between visual arts and mechanical arts is my strength. And I don't find it very often, but it's what the best visual effects people can do. You know, the world that we see, I see you, I see him, I see this room, arrives through the lenses of my eyes and arrives at the retinas of my eyes, upside down and backwards. And those two images are sent electrochemically into my visual cortex. The only place the image of you that exists for me is on my retina. You're not really there. I think you're there. I project you to be there because it all matches up. I can correct what I think I see with what I believe I see. I've kind of gotten to this existential feeling about human perception that it's possible to put images onto the retina of one's eyes that are indistinguishable from reality.
So I think maybe we will begin. And for those who weren't here this morning, we've set up a little COVID-free zone by the podium here with my own personal air filter. So I'm taking off my mask in an awareness that I'm far enough from any of you and fully boosted. So welcome to this hybrid event, Boundary Conditions, an exploration of architecture, simulation, and cinema. This entire event came about in part because of the discussions of what I affectionately call the transmedia team, the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative, fantastic researchers and artists and students who let me know that virtual production was the thing we should be doing in our final symposium. And then the great benefit of having Nicholas DeMoncho as an incoming head of architecture who has actually been researching virtual production as infused by architectural skill sets and architectural interests. So this came about quite naturally as a result of these converging interests. And I couldn't be more thrilled to have you here and to have the virtual audience here for this capstone event. I'm going to read a little bit of the introduction that I wrote for this morning because why not? It's a new crowd, a new moment. And forgive me for reading, but there are a lot of people to thank. So first of all, I want to thank the dean, Hashim Sarkis, who had the initial vision that media making was an important part of what we do at the School of Architecture and Planning here at MIT, even before he learned what a significant part of our past had been devoted to filmmaking under the leadership of Ricky Leacock and Gloriana Davenport. But vision needs support, and for this I want to thank the arts at MIT under the leadership of Leela Kinney, MIT Nano, which has the open-minded folks Brian Anthony and Tom Geardy, who see sensing at the nano scale, an important link with the arts. The MIT Center for Advanced Virtuality under the direction of Professor Fox Harrell. The Virtual Experience Design Lab at MIT, which serves the entire School of Architecture and Planning. The Art, Culture, and Technology Program, or ACT as we call it, and the Department of Architecture. All of these supplied tremendous resources of material, equipment, sweat equity, expertise, and of course, this goes back to the founding donors of the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative itself, David and Nina Fialco. I hope they're streaming this event now that it's raining outside. But of course, if they get a notion to come in person, we'd love to see them. More personally, I want to thank Transmedia team members, Dr. Shadi Zaman in architecture. Shadi became a father about a week ago. So we gave him a pass at coming in person to this event, but it couldn't have happened without him. Shadi manages both his own NSF-supported research and the Virtual Experience Design Lab, which I mentioned earlier. His support was aided and abetted by his sometime collaborator, the independent filmmaker, artist, and transmedia producer, Dennis Tortum, who ran the first panel in today's program. Both of them were the ones that emphasized that virtual production really needed our attention. They were living this reality during the pandemic that forced Zaman's class on virtuality and presence, taught with Professor Fox Harrell in the fall of 2020, and Zaman's collaboration with Tortum on graduate workshops in virtuality last spring, entirely into remote classrooms, which turns out to be more challenging than you might think. Thus, the work of students in the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative's first physical exhibition across the street, open until 9 o'clock. You'll be forgiven for dashing out of here and skipping this panel. This exhibition reflects the pandemical condition and the isolation for which virtuality only partially compensates. The exhibition is titled, in relation to this symposium, Unbounded, Transmedia Storytelling at MIT 2019-2021, and it's on view at the Wiesner Gallery in the Stratton Student Center. I highly recommend this, not the least for its brilliant exhibition design by MArch graduate alumni Dalma Fadesi and Chung Inseol. The exhibition and many, many production details of this symposium were produced by the indispensable Emma Zhu, right here, and the newly enrolled Alejandro Medina, right over there. They both hit the ground running for this thing. Emma and Alejandro turned the hectic schedule of production this fall into an exhilarating and joyful experience. So here we are, living the hybrid conditions that this symposium addresses, bringing our meat machines into the room or facing the screen, bringing with them their mysterious capacities for sensing and making reality out of a physical world of electromagnetic, haptic, and olfactory information. Those capacities, the boundary conditions alluded to in our title, are both limits and portals into an entirely fabulous virtuality that humans feel compelled to produce. Pixels and bits, point clouds and pointers, we love our mediated realities, and I need to throw in Jeannie's terms of mapping and meaning. They seem to give us the goads for culturally transforming ourselves into alternate selves. Now more urgently than ever, such alternatives are needed to the hypothesized selfish genes or hyper-individuals of before times. The alternatives our brilliant panelists have been exploring open onto compassion, wonder, and sometimes trauma. They might direct us toward alternative ways of living with the planet. So we're now in the third of our 3 panels. It's been an exhilarating day, but a little tiring. So we're going to try and wrap this panel up in about an hour. We may not be able to get to all the questions that this discussion will generate. It's my honor to introduce Nicholas de Moncho, who will, in turn, introduce our guest of honor, Douglas Trumbull, whose a short video was produced by Denise Tortum on a previous interview that Nicholas had with Douglas earlier this fall. So without further ado, Nicholas and Douglas, could you come and sit here?
Hi there.
Hey everyone, welcome. So I'm going to give Doug a brief introduction. He doesn't need any introduction given his stature in the world of history of visual storytelling, but let's go for it. So this is, of course, the concluding discussion of the Boundary Conditions Symposium of the Transmedia Storytelling Initiative, and that fact is going to anchor much of the many things that we're going to talk about, we could possibly talk about, with one of the giants of 20th and 21st century multimedia storytelling, the effects pioneer, director, and technologist, Douglas Trumbull. For those 0.5 of individuals who might be in the room and not knowing the giant and legend that they're in the room with, Douglas Trumbull was born in Los Angeles, where his father, Donald Trumbull, had worked in Hollywood on effects for films, including The Wizard of Oz, before being diverted, at least for several decades, into the adjacent world of aviation technology during the Second World War and afterwards. As Doug will share with us this evening, he grew up surrounded by tools and parts and movies and art, and his career would bring them together multiple times in multiple ways throughout the last 6 decades. Doug started his own career as a graphic artist involved in the filmmaking process in LA, which brought him quickly and directly, as I'll let him explain, into the orbit of Stanley Kubrick and the making of 2001. From there, his career grew to include special effects for films like The Andromeda Strain and his own influential science fiction film Silent Running. Trumbull then formed the Future General Corporation as a subsidiary of Paramount Pictures, where he pioneered new techniques of storytelling through filmed and projected images, in particular the 70mm 60 frame per second technique of Showscan, which led to his second directorial feature, Brainstorm. His interest in immersive perceptual storytelling then led to a series of architectural experiences, including the Back to the Future ride and a series of rides for the Luxor Hotel and others. During this period, Trumbull moved his research and production base here to Massachusetts, where he continues to experiment and produce innovations in high frame rate, immersive, and three-dimensional cinema to the present day. So Doug, welcome back to MIT. This is far from your first visit.
Great to be here again.
And to our conversation tonight.
Thank you.
So, for an audience with a wide range of different experiences with the technologies and stories we will discuss, I proposed, and we discussed earlier, moving across the time and space of your career in a few different ways, picking up a thread of a conversation we started a few weeks ago in your studio. The framing idea of this conversation we proposed to each other and now to you as the audience is the idea of the mechanism of perception, which of course lets us talk about the mechanism of perception in our own minds and brains, but also about the literal mechanisms in particular that Doug has produced over his career to affect and influence our perception through the process of storytelling. So we'll go roughly chronologically through a couple of different ideas for probably about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to you in the audience for questions. But there's a particular machine mechanism that I wanted to start with, or two related mechanisms, the slit scan machine and the Jupiter machine, I believe it was called, that involved self-synchronizing motors, train tracks, and if I'm not mistaken, a propeller in a tub of molasses.
Yes.
And so I thought that this almost Rube Goldbergian sounding mechanism would be a great place to start with both the story of how you got there in your as you described to me, in your cowboy boots and cowboy hat. You got to the point of making those machines from your work at Graphic Arts, but then also the machines themselves, and not so much their technical details, but the ideas behind perception that were behind them. So I'll let you take the story from there. How did you get to those machines, and what were they to you?
Well, it comes out of having spent a lot of time in my dad's shop, so I was totally unintimidated by drill presses and lathes and mills and sanders and things like that. So I'm a tool guy, and I know what I can do with tools. And this problem came up in 2001 for the Stargate, and no one on the production could figure out how to do it. And they were all really serious, extremely established production designers and photographers and everything, and no one could figure out what to do, because it was initially written by Arthur Clarke as a slot in one of Jupiter's moons, which none of us could figure out how to make that look interesting. And I thought, well, I'm just going to go back to basics and try to find some alternate solution. And it went back to John Whitney Jr., John Whitney Sr., actually, at the time, who'd worked at Graphic, who was exploring this idea that you could move moire patterns and artwork with backlit gelatin and create an accumulated exposure over time to create other patterns that didn't exist in the real world.
And do you want to explain where that came from in the context of the Dome movie that you?
Well, the Dome movie called for this sequence that depicted the kind of micro world of energy and particles and atomic particles and molecules and things like that. So it went all the way from the Big Bang to...
Remind me the title of the film. This was the film...
Moon and Beyond.
To the Moon and Beyond.
Which was very topical for the day of Apollo 11.
And this was the movie that Kubrick saw, correct? That led to the...
So it validated his and Arthur Clarke's idea that you could actually make a movie on any format, because this was 70 millimeter film on a dome. And it validated that idea, and so he contacted Graphic Films immediately and said, well, could you help us do some pre-production visualization artwork? And so I was still working at Graphic, and so I started doing that for Kubrick. And my boss, who was Con Pedersen, who also ended up working on 2001. And then Kubrick decided to make the movie at Borehamwood Studios in England, which was way too far away for airmail. And there were certainly no fax machines or facsimiles or digital photography or anything at the time as a means of communication. So it was going to be stalled. And he just decided, well, I'm just going to have to deal with my guys in England and make this movie. And Graphic got terminated. Our contract got terminated. And I called Con and I said, I want to work for this Kubrick guy. He just did the atomic bomb movie, what was it called? Dr. Strangelove. And I said, this guy is amazing, and I want to work for him. So I cold called Stanley Kubrick based on a phone number that was penciled in the corner of the bulletin board at the office. And I said, I want to work for you. And so it didn't take but a few days before a ticket for me and my wife came, and we jetted over, and I started working on the movie. So that turned out to be the most heavenly mentorship anybody could ever look into. And it turned out that my mixture of artistry, because I was a painter, an illustrator, I was kind of really good at gouache and painting on celluloid and things for animated movies. Mixing that with mechanical engineering was what Kubrick really needed. And that just turned out to be a perfect marriage for us.
So back to Whitney, and then...
So Whitney, he worked out this way. So I could see, oh, here's what's going on here. He's accumulating light on film over a period of several seconds, sometimes longer, maybe a minute, of some moving devices, mechanical devices with motors that could move these patterns around with mores and lights behind and accumulate. And I thought, well, if you went one step further and you did it dimensionally in this axis, in the z-axis, maybe you could create this corridor of light that would just like come out of the sky. or something. We didn't know what, but that's what actually happened. And the idea of accumulated light is like if you can imagine taking a photograph of the Mass Pike at night, but you leave the shutter open, and all those cars are going down. And some of the cars you're going to be looking into their headlights, and some of the cars you're going to be looking at their taillights, but you're going to see these streaks of light. And if you can simply go to the next dimension, which is if you could tell everybody in their car to turn their lights on and off, it would be dots and dashes. And you can take that to an extreme, which is to make artwork that does that on a plane, but the plane becomes a volume. So the plane was a big sheet of glass. The artwork we made was on a big sheet of glass, and I had this very thin slit, which is what you'd call a focal plane shutter in a camera. So I was pretty astute about photography, and I thought, well, we could just use that slit and accumulate light. So the slit is way off across the room, 15 feet away, and as the camera moves toward the slit, the camera is focusing constantly. So I built a focus cam that ran on one of these Selson motors so that it was in focus all the time from 15 feet to 1 inch, except for the occasional times where it just slammed through the glass. But anyhow, that was just the idea of creating a plane of light.
Right.
And then it ultimately became two planes of light, one on the left and one on the right, or one on the top and one on the bottom, which did the Stargate of this artwork, which was an amalgam of grids and charts and Morey patterns and electron microscope photographs and organic things, all kinds of mixture of things with colored gels to create these abstracted patterns that you couldn't make out what the heck they were, but it looked really cool. And that became the Stargate.
How was the first iteration or idea of that you prototyped and I think took a Polaroid photograph of? How was that in the end different from the 70 millimeter version? Was it the same idea, just built up in scale? Or?
Totally different. Kubrick was a big fan of Polaroid photography.
Yeah.
And he had I think his only, I wouldn't call it a mental block, but he couldn't envision things in his mind the way I could and like the way a lot of other artists do. And he wanted to see a photograph of something all the time. Any shot, any angle, any camera position, he wanted to see a photograph. So it was Polaroids. So he had a Polaroid camera he carried around. I had one. Everybody on the crew had one. And we had one on the animation stand. The animation stand is nothing but a camera that moves up and down toward a flat plane of backlit artwork. And one day I thought, well, I'll just make a Polaroid for Stanley to show him this idea. So I made a little slit, which was, like a 1/16 of an inch wide, about a foot long, and slid this artwork behind the slit while the camera came down the track. And I was blown away because that was the seminal moment where I could see this was going to work. And if you knew anything about Polaroid photography at that time, you had to put a fixative on the Polaroid, with a little, like a squeegee thing, to fix it. Otherwise, it would just continue to develop. And so I fixed it, and it was still wet, and I just ran down to Stanley's office, and I said, I think this could fix this problem you have. And for me, conceptually, the idea was about time and space, which was the background for the previous panel, which was, I thought that if you can accumulate light over time and you can make abstract patterns that don't exist in the real world, by doing that, that would solve the problem for the movie, but it seems to be perfectly in sync with the concept he needed to solve, which was that the Coeur d'Alene has to go through time and space. And so I've had that in my mind. Every time I come up against any problem in a movie, I kind of go back to that root, which is trying to address what's the core problem here, and how could you solve it, and how do you solve it in a way that's actually in sync with what the problem itself is. In this case, it was time and space. So that led to the Jupiter machine.
Yes, this is less well known, but I wanted you to talk about it.
Less well known. I don't talk about it nearly that much. But that was a light lathe. It was a circular version of the slit scan machine that I came up with months later, because no one could paint. We had really great illustrators on the movie. They couldn't paint Jupiter to look photographically believable or round or spherical. It just looked two-dimensional. And so I thought, well, we could just apply the slit scan thing and make a little semicircular slit rather than a straight slit and spin it very slowly. This over 3 or 4 hours exposure to create a sphere of exposed light. And that worked great. Today, you got a good computer, you can do it with a mouse click.
Right.
You know, but then we had to do it mechanically.
But it goes to this idea of perception, because when you're seeing the planet Jupiter and its moons in the film, you're not actually seeing objects. You're seeing the slow sweep of over time of just a single bar of light that creates the perceptual reality of that.
Yeah.
Maybe we can, before we leave the entire world of 2001, I would love for you to put together 2 stories that we've talked about. One is I think it was your first piece of work on the film, which was all the technical readouts on the displays in the big Centrifuge set, but then also the more recent work that you've been doing to try and kind of re-understand that Centrifuge set and the wide-angle lenses that were being used to shoot it at the time,
Right.
Through virtual reality, through Unity, which I thought is a great kind of time bridge between 2 different pieces of work.
Yeah, it is. It's really cool. And we're going beyond Unity now. We're using Unreal Engine 4.25 or something, but we're hopefully looking forward to getting Unreal UE5.
Okay.
Which is going to have even better lighting and better texture maps and stuff. And we're exploring this whole world of virtual production now.
Right.
Which I've been on this jag for 30 years, since we did the Book of Pooh for Disney. We put Pooh and all the Pooh characters into a virtual set that was fully dimensional. It's like a pop-up book.
Right.
It was like 2-dimensional. We were using silicon graphics. Reality engines at the time, which were even then cost almost $1 million. And since then, I've been exploring this idea, this thing that you could actually make a whole movie using virtual sets, which would cost a fraction of what movies cost today. You don't have to build them physically. And then that gives you this fabulous transmedia opportunity to take those sets and locations and characters or monsters or whatever you build for your movie and put it into a game, put it into a television series, put it into a feature movie, put it into the sequel movie by managing these assets very carefully and planning it all out so that they're useful to you. And that's the jag I'm on. I'm hoping I'll make a film sometime soon that's going to be done that way. It'll be all virtual.
But when you're trying to create these virtual worlds, this is the piece of it in terms of especially that initial production. There's something about like truthfulness versus veracity. So I think the story of those of the displays is actually particularly interesting in that regard, because you came in and you had this problem to solve of what were all these displays going to show, and there was not enough time to figure it out systematically, and so you had to figure out a way to tell a story visually that made us all believe that they were real, but had its own. I'll let you tell the story.
Yeah, the problem that we hit was that Stanley wanted, in any shot in the movies, like in the Centrifuge, there could be a dozen movies going on simultaneously on all of Hal's screens. There were Hal's right in the middle, and there's like 6 of them over here, and 6 of them over here, and a couple more over there, and several more in the pod bay, and they're all over the place. And we had to make thousands of feet of fake animated computer graphics movies really quickly. And that meant that we couldn't use conventional animation techniques, which is, if you're doing animation, you have a cue sheet. You have this long piece of paper that's worse than 17 inches long, with a line for it. It's like a spreadsheet. It says, well, you're going to put in artwork number 32B is here, and place it at this size, and put a blue gel behind it and flash it or whatever. And you had to make all these detailed instructions. And we hired an animation camera service to do it, and we figured we're gonna be at this for years before Kubrick gets this movie finished. So we said we had to figure out how to extemporaneously make these computer graphics by building our own little animation stand and motorizing it, and working very closely between me and the animation cameraman, his name was Bruce Logan, to just say, we worked out this shorthand and said, well, take this cell, put it there, flash it 3 times, and we called it razzle dazzle. We had this whole kind of lingo that we used between the colors, because we had the colors all worked out. We know what gels would result in what colors, and in one day we made 1,000 feet of animation, of just like putting it in, clicking off the frames, and then backing up the camera, and then clicking off more frames. It went on and on and on, but it was just what Kubrick called problem solving. If you have a problem, solve it. And I've been working on a documentary about Stanley Kubrick right now that we're going to be meeting in LA in about a week. I hope it'll go forward. That's going to be hopefully the definitive Uber documentary about Stanley Kubrick in the making of 2001 from the unique perspective I had of being there with him all the time. And we hope to get that done. He talks a lot about problem solving.
Yeah.
And he also talks, I have recordings of him talking about how he was a misfit in school. He just did not cut it in school. He did not like school. He didn't go to school. He only went like half the time. He was out playing stickball in New York or whatever else, or playing chess with people on the streets. And he was just what he called himself, a misfit. And it wasn't until he got personally intrigued and interested in photography that his life started to turn around. And so as a young 17-year-old, he was starting to sell really good, well-staged photographs to Look magazine, which was one of the big periodicals of the time, of just street action or stuff going on in New York City. But he always told a story. Every photograph he took told a story of sadness or passion or love or something. And so he had a regular, so he sold photographs to Look magazine for 4 years, and he says, that's my college.
Yeah.
He literally said it that way. He says, I'm done. I know how to make money, and I know how to take photographs, and I'm going to move on to making movies, stories, which was his next step.
Do you feel like that mirrored your own experience?
Yeah, I'm a misfit too.
Yeah.
I've always been. I've never been to college or university.
Yeah.
I'm totally self-taught, and so I just kind of figure it out on my own. It's that hands-on kind of thing that makes it very easy for me to do what I do. Yeah. It's effortless.
Well, there's something in that story of the technical readouts in the Centrifuge that I think gets to a core theme that goes throughout your work, which is not so much trying to create a whole world that makes sense out there in itself in the set, but trying to make a world that makes sense in your eye and in your perception of it. And one of the most literal mechanisms involved in that was something that was developed in 2001, but then you took to a whole new level in Silent Running and in your work on Close Encounters, which is this, on the one hand, very basic technique of front projection, of just beaming a very high resolution image at people as you're filming them, and so their shadows are completely aligned with the camera itself. But I wondered if you could just take us through because you did a lot of work to make that a kind of piece of storytelling that was accessible to lots of different kinds of film and filmmakers, and I think that would be an interesting thing to think about.
Well, after 2001, it really took off.
Yeah.
And I used it a lot on Silent Running. And the idea of front projection is actually quite elegantly simple. If you're driving your car at night and you see a reflector sign that bounces the light back at your headlights, which is really what's happening, but you see it as a bright image too, that is made up of millions, billions of tiny beads of transparent glass embedded in plastic in a sandwich that 3M makes, and other companies make it too. But Kubrick found out about this, and it had been explored previously because 3M was already making this material in large sheets. And the idea was that if you could build a giant screen at the end of the stage and project images of Africa, and Namibia was the place we used, for this Dawn of Man sequence and build a big set in front of that, you could create this seamless composite, which is the opening sequence of the movie. It's 17 or 20 minutes long with no dialogue or anything, but it's just all front projection. And it works really great if you do it well. If you make a mistake, you can really make a big mistake. But it's a wonderful technology because any ray of light that hits that bead of glass bounces back toward where it came from. That's the whole idea.
Yeah.
It's called retroreflectivity. And the brightness of it getting bounced back is 250 times brighter than where it would fall on your jacket or a table or a floor or anything.
Yeah.
So it's unnoticeable, it's unphotographable.
Yeah.
It's so dim. But where that screen is, if it's all lined up on the same optical axis with a 45-degree mirror, half the light is passing through the mirror to the screen and then coming back to the mirror into the camera. I can't explain it any better than that, but it works really great. And I built a very small front projection machine for my film Silent Running. And so we did a lot of really cool process shots that were very inexpensive, simple to do, easy and quick. Whereas the way Kubrick did it was very difficult and very heavy. The machine weighed a ton.
Right.
And the optical system he built for front projection required a big, 20,000 watt arc lamp on it and huge condenser lenses. The logo for the shows actually looks like a bunch of condenser lenses.
Very intentional, yeah.
Is it?
We'll decide that it is.
It looks like lenses. Okay.
Yeah.
So this thing was so cumbersome on the stage that they had to build the entire set on a rotating turntable to get different camera angles. So that's one of the big things that very few people even are aware of in the movie. In order for Kubrick to say, well, I want Moonwatcher to come up close and I want these rocks here and a little pond of water here, et cetera, he had to rotate the whole damn set because the screen was fastened to the wall of the stage. So there was that's what this documentary is going to touch on. And I just did a show at the Museum of the Moving Image in New York a couple of weeks ago and talked all about this. I've got a bunch of really cool slides and behind-the-scenes stuff on the way the movie was made. So it's this weird, constant barrage of mechanical engineering and optics mixed with artistry and visuals and photography.
Well, there's one more piece of that history I think it would be great for us to touch on before we get to the movie technology itself and Cinerama and Showscan and the Méliès system you've developed. But that's the motion control piece of it too, because that's also a huge part of your history. You started out with these sort of World War II era bomber motors with synchronizing the camera motion and the motion of models and to create realistic motion. And then and then made huge advances in your later films with multi-channel systems. But I thought it'd be wonderful to hear you talk about not so much the technical details of those systems, but how they affected the look and feel of the film, from the slowness to 2001 to everything you were able to do, for example, with very different with Close Encounters. Or so how does that technology shape a kind of reality that we then?
Well, the technology of 2001 was we had one big motor driving a big shaft, and that shaft connected to a bunch of gearboxes that were gearboxes off lathes. You could set them to different ratios. So one gearbox would then output to another shaft that would go to a synchronous motor that would go to the pan axis or to the tilt axis or to the track motion or to the focus or to the camera itself. So all you got was perfect synchronization between all those motors over the length of a shot. And so the shot might pan a little bit, or it might tilt a little bit, or it might whatever, but it was all constant speed. And it was that constant speed that was so frustrating for all of us on the movie, because it meant that you were just stuck with this balletic thing that actually led to the music score working so well, which was everything is just constantly moving like a big ballet. And so that worked out for Kubrick.
Yeah.
And when I got back to LA, my father-in-law was an engineer at a technical company, and I started learning about stepper motors, which are these magnetic pulse-driven motors. So you could record a pulse chain of square wave pulses. You could record it on your stereo tape recorder if you wanted to, and play them into the motor driver. And you could vary the speed anything you wanted, fast, slow, slow in, slow out, back up, whatever you wanted to do. So for close encounters, we could make the UFOs, you know, fly like World War II bombers or fighter planes, which was simultaneously with George Lucas doing exactly the same thing on Star Wars, because he wanted all this, you know, dogfighting kind of thing that emulated World War II dogfight photography. So you have to have motors that change speeds. And we worked it out, and thank God it was there. Somebody had already made these motors.
And you mentioned something I read once about the ways in which all the things were, the UFOs were designed in Close Encounters that also touches on this issue of perception, because you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, that they were all designed to slightly resemble faces, so that you would notice them. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So if you just, you know, next time if you ever come to watch Close Encounters on your home, just freeze frame it on any scene with UFOs in it and just study it, because you'll see big eyes and nostrils and teeth. Even though the whole shape of it looks like a cheeseburger from McDonald's, it's a face. Yeah. And there's a face on a face on a face. And they're all got beams of light coming out of them all over the place, which is obscuring the shape of it. But Spielberg we explored all kinds of crazy ways of trying to achieve the idea that the aliens had somehow tried to make us happy by emulating what we liked. And so he had a deal with McDonald's somewhere along the line. And so we made one big golden arch. It was about a foot wide and about 18 inches tall. He says, well, if you just fly those guys toward the camera, but make sure that they both get like that. And then it'll be the M. Well, we tried that, and it was stupid, and we're just laughing and said, this is the dumbest thing we've ever tried. So that's not in the movie. But we did a lot of other things. There's a lot of there's children's toys and trucks and gas masks and all kinds of things flying around.
Oh, in the model. But I think that the face thing is so interesting, because it gets to this question of how, of our reality being the reality of our vision versus the reality of the world, because our evolved neurological program is to see and understand faces far more than any other kind of object. And so there's something about the way in which we see and hold those objects for their containing faces, which is very different than if they were just spheres or another kind of thing. And this really gets to the kind of last but maybe longest piece of history I wanted to take you through before we go to questions from our audience, both here and online. But there was there's another thread through your life, which is not the technology of what's behind the camera, but the technology of what's projected in the theater, which goes from your first encounter with Cinerama when you were just an observer in LA to your own work on creating faster, more immersive film. And so can you take us through that story? Can you take us from Cinerama to Showscan to some of your current work and what you're trying to do with it?
Yeah, a little bit, because prior to are you familiar with Cinerama, the original three-camera,
probably
projector?
Everyone on a slightly older generation is, but maybe for our audience you could just...
Well, okay, here's the deal. A guy named Fred Waller, who was an inventor, engineer, filmmaker at one of the major studios, came up with this idea of having a panorama, a deeply curved panorama screen that would be made up of 3 separate 35 millimeter images, softly blended, so you couldn't see, hopefully you couldn't see the blend line. This was a very tricky film technology to use and make work, because he realized that you had to make the color prints of all 3 prints exactly match on every shot. The sky had to be just as blue here as it was here. And it was a nightmare of technological finessing to make it work. But it grew out of something that predated Cinerama, which was a gunnery trainer that he built, which was a hemispherical screen, kind of like our show we did for the New York World's Fair, projecting into a dome with 5 projectors, 5 movies, training young gunners in B-29 bombers to shoot airplanes out of the sky by leading the target just enough to hit it properly, with figuring out the technology of flying at 350 miles an hour at 5,000 feet altitude and being chased by other fighter planes that are going at different speeds, and figuring out for the gunner, and Fred Waller worked out this technique of training these gunners. They had actual fake machine guns to shoot at this screen. It was really a cool device on these Sperry turrets that were in the B-29 bombers. And so he trained them, and they think they saved 300,000 lives during World War II and won the war.
This brings up this idea of film not as a kind of aesthetic object, but as a simulation of reality. And so, so then maybe take us to the point where you first encountered Cinerama.
Well, my father, who was, by that time, he was not in the movie business anymore. You know, by the time I was born, he was back in the aircraft, he was working for Lockheed Aviation out in the San Fernando Valley. And this is a really weird time in American history where everybody was terrified that the Japanese were going to attack the west coast of the United States. Just terrified. So there were blackouts all the time. And the entire factory of Lockheed Aviation out in the San Fernando Valley was draped with camouflage to where if you were up in the air at a couple thousand feet, it would just look like some residential district with horses and stuff. The horses were all fake and fiberglass, and the houses were fake, and they were actually on top of the factory buildings of... Anyway, so there was a big movie illusion. They hired movie people from Disney to help design this illusion to fake the Japanese out that nobody was home in LA. So it's a long, long story. I could go on forever. But anyhow, everybody thought LA was going to get attacked. I was born during an air raid.
Well,
I think it was very prescient to me. So, and I was not only born during an air raid, I was born when the hospital was on fire. So it was a double thing for my mom and my dad, and very dramatic. So I don't know where I'm going with.
No, but your dad. So your encounter with, as you've described it, with Cinerama, with the commercial version of this, was a very important moment. In terms
Yes,
of
it was this humongous panorama. The screen was 100 feet wide.
Yeah.
That's big.
Yeah.
And deeply curved, so it had this kind of depth to it.
Right.
And I was profoundly affected by it, even though the first several films that they made in Cinerama were just travelogues. Cinerama Holiday and Cinerama, this is Cinerama, and just boring travelogues.
Right.
But the stunning sense of presence of being involved in the movie, particularly if you sat near the front row, it was really powerful. And then along came the biggest dramatic movie that MGM made in the Cinerama process, which was called How the West Was Won, with 3 major movie directors, and this movie just blew my mind that you could actually tell a story, not just a travelogue, and so that affected me. And then by the time that had all gone down, everybody in the movie industry started realizing, well, there were serious problems with going to a non-standard format. It was very, very strange, particularly for the actors, because they found out that if you shot an actor on the left panel and an actor in the middle panel and an actor on the right panel, they couldn't actually look at each other when you were shooting the scene. They had to kind of look off, and then to the audience, it looked like they were looking at each other. And so the directors are saying, this is a pain in the neck. Right. And so the directors all kind of mutinied and said, we're not going to do this anymore. Yeah. And it was very expensive, but it was making a huge amount of money. Yeah. And so they changed over to 70 millimeter because Mike Todd had come in with Todd AO, which was another, it was a single film that was double width. Right. So they could almost fill these giant screens with 70 millimeter. And it looked great, but it made the filmmaking process much more simple and intuitive and less risky. And So that was another stepping stone for me, because my dad always made sure I went and saw these movies. Whatever it was, I would go see these movies. So that was my early years with my dad, was being exposed to amazing technological feats of lenses and optics and screens and
so then you went to work after Silent Running with and started Future General and Paramount, and then you started working on film formats yourself. So do you want to take us through that story a little bit and how?
Well, I don't know how long we want to go on here, because you've got a couple of other things to show. But yeah, I became kind of fascinated with the whole technology of movies, and I was in a really bad time at my life, because it was post Silent Running, which was a pretty successful little movie. But I had development deals, that's what they call them, at Fox, Warner Brothers, MGM. I had deals going on at studios, because I was the young enfant terrible in Hollywood, making sci-fi movies. And Silent Running was very respected. And I wasn't making any money, because they don't pay you for development deals. They pay you when you make the movie. So I saw all these movies derailing for stupid reasons. It was completely idiotic. Like one of the studios, they just decided to have what we call musical chairs. They just got rid of the entire board of directors at Fox or Warner Brothers, whoever it was, and replaced them with new people. And so the movie I was developing there just hit the dust. And then I was making a movie development with Frank, what was his name? Arthur Jacobs, who had done Planet of the Apes. Yeah. Very brilliant producer. And we were ready to go. We had the script written, and we were ready to make this movie, and we had location scouted, and he had a massive heart attack and died. And the movie and everything else got tied up in his estate. So those kind of things kept going. And so I went to my lawyer. I said, oh, God, I got to make a living here somehow. Yeah. And we came up with this idea of starting a research and development company for Paramount. The whole thing was this tax scam. Yeah. I'm not responsible for the tax scam. They thought it up. Yeah. But they said, if we own 80% of the company, we can write it entirely off on our taxes. Right. So I said, fine, take it. I just want to get a paycheck. Yeah. So we started this company called Future General Corporation. My partner, Richard Yursich, and I, who have been working together for years and years, started experimenting with every film format we could find to get our hands on. We tried D150 and Todd AO and Technorama and Technoscope and everything, and we saw, they all kind of look the same. There's nothing really going on here that's breaking new ground. We tried IMAX, and then it was only then that we decided, well, what we haven't tried is frame rates. And so we shot a little test one day, and it was just a little 16 millimeter test of a guy golfing. So we're back up behind this place where you tee off and you watch the ball go down the fairway. And we shot it at 24, 36, 48, 60, 66 frames a second, 72 frames a second in 16 millimeters. It's very simple. And we did it that way because we could trash these projectors. They were military, ex-military 16 millimeter projectors that you could just put a big motor on there and speed it up and hope it didn't fly apart, which it did. But the guy that was going to tee off, he would go like this and wind up to hit the ball, and you would see right away in those first 8, 10 frames that the entire golf club and his hands and everything simply disappeared. It was blurred and not being captured photographically. And then he'd finish his swing, and then the ball would just disappear. And he said, well, where did the ball go? And then we started speeding it up and speeding it up and speeding it up, and suddenly realized, oh, if you speed it up, you can see everything. This was like a big aha moment for him and me. And we settled on 60 frames a second, 70 millimeter as the way to go. We called it Showscan. And we showed it to Paramount Pictures, who owned us. And we talked with Charlie Bludorn, who was the chairman of the board of Gulf and Western that owned Paramount Pictures. And he jumped out of his seat in the theater and says, gentlemen, if we don't make a movie in this process, we're fools. This is the future. Let's go for it. So I got a mandate to make a movie that would be partly in Showscan and partly not. because he said this other, he said, got his sentence out. He says, you know, what you got to do, Doug, is you got to show the audience the difference. Show part of the movie in regular and part of the movie in Showscan. Then they'll get it, and then the industry will get it.
That was Brainstorm.
That was Brainstorm. Sadly, after several years of effort, I couldn't get any studio in the world, including Paramount, to do anything in a new process. So I had to just kind of give up on it.
Well, but it led indirectly to your work creating the immersive ride experiences.
Yeah, that was out of desperation.
Yeah.
Because the story that I'm not going to go into in great detail, but it was the story of my life, which was that Natalie Wood died during production, and I came to believe that she was murdered. And I'd never told anybody. I couldn't go public with that idea. I can do it here because you guys are all going to keep it secret. That there was really bad foul play going on at the studio. The studio was bankrupt, couldn't afford to finish the movie. There was plenty of motive to not finish the movie. I met with studio executives. They said, Doug, we're not going to finish this movie. It's unfinishable. And I said, you are wrong. I'm going to have 3 little scenes with Natalie, and I'm just going to leave them out of the movie. Yeah. I don't need to do any hanky-panky. It's not a problem finishing the movie. And they disagreed with me and fired me and fired everybody else. And then I got into a deposition with Lloyd's of London, who were the insurance company, and they asked me the same questions. I said, I can finish this movie. This is not a problem. I mean, I'm not saying anything derogatory about Natalie Wood, because she did a great job, and she had shot the movie out of continuity. Yeah. We had everything from the beginning to the end. And that just changed my life, because getting the movie finished nearly killed me. I ended up in the hospital with ulcers and all kinds of other stuff. And then I just decided, I said, if they kill people over movies and budgets, I'm out of here. I'm leaving Hollywood. So I just pulled the plug on my career, sold my house, and moved to Massachusetts, which is beautiful. So
we're glad to have you.
Here I am. And so we did the Back to the Future ride. Yeah. That was the first job that came up. I said, I'm not going to make feature films. I'm going to do something else, which is going to be along the lines of all this other crazy scientific, technical, photographic stuff. And the Back to the Future ride was that. It was IMAX in a dome. They couldn't figure out how to do it. They'd already hired friends of mine to do it, and they were $3 million into it, and nothing worked, and everybody threw up. And so I said, I can fix that. Yeah. So I had to come up with this whole cinematic language of how to move the DeLorean motion bases in sync with the movie perfectly so that you didn't throw up. Right. And that worked. And I got the job. It was the most fun we've ever had making a movie, was the Back to the Future ride. It was just a total gas.
And you're quintessentially not creating the thing, but you're creating the experience of it, and the subjective experience of it.
Yeah. So it was only 3 minutes and 58 seconds of thrill ride. Yeah. And it was just so much fun doing it, and it was so satisfying to do it, and it was so successful. And later on, I went back and I said, you know, I'm not a profit participant. Yeah. You don't get any profit participation in rides at theme parks. I was paid well, but I figured that they probably made $2 billion on this one ride. It ran for 16 years in 3 parks, 24 hours a day almost. It was very, very successful. So that got me onto believing that there was an alternate future for me out of feature films. And so I started kind of drifting in that direction, and I ended up talking to friends at IMAX, who were these wonderful guys. Are you familiar with IMAX, how it worked? The original rolling loop, 70 millimeter, 15 perf. Each frame of film was 10 times bigger than a 35 millimeter movie. And they were all aging out and very tired and wanted to retire. So I said, okay, I will try to find some investment bankers. We're going to buy IMAX, and we're going to take it public, and we're going to bring it into the mainstream of movies. So I did that with them in 1994. It was very enlightening, because we had to do what's called an IPO roadshow, which is that you go on a private G4 jet from town to town, whether it was Dallas or New York or Florida or LA or London or whatever, and you do private screenings, not screening, presentations to investment bankers. And that's when I learned how dumb investment bankers are.
It's another form of creating perceptions.
Yeah, it was all about creating perceptions. They hadn't a clue what they were getting into, but we raised $350 million and brought IMAX into the mainstream. So it's one of the most recognizable logos of any movie studio in the world is IMAX. If you look on the, if you can get a newspaper these days, it'll say IMAX is bigger than anything else in the list of movies. So they're doing really well, and I did really well from it, and that kind of was the springboard for me to start moving off into my next step, which was following on to what I was doing with Showscan, because the movie industry had gone through this transition from celluloid to digital all at once. It was a big, very tumultuous period of movies, but George Lucas spearheaded it and Disney spearheaded it, and the whole industry got behind it, and they formed the digital DCI, Digital Cinema Initiative Partners group, which spanned all the studios. So that all the studios could have the same digital standard of how to make a movie and for digital presentation. And then digital post-production came along, and digital sound and THX and Dolby Atmos and all those kind of things fell along with digital projection, which became 3D digital projection. And I could go on forever about this, but I found out that 3D digital projection is 144 frames a second. And I said, well, why don't we just use that? Nobody's using it. It's there. It's in tens of thousands of theaters around the world. 144 frames a second. And no one's, still they're making movies at 24. And I said, this is nuts. So I got on this jag that we got to pull the industry up by the bootstraps and stop making movies at 24. So I'm still on that.
In one way or another, yeah.
I'm not giving up.
Very good.
So cool.
Yeah.
What we're doing in 4K 3D at 120 frames is mind-boggling.
Oh, you showed it to us. It was amazing. Oops, sorry. It was appropriate. So now I think it's a good moment to shift, to continue the conversations with a couple of questions. So do we have questions from the audience? Do you have questions from the audience online? Go ahead. Let's wait till you get the mic so our online friends can hear you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
My question is actually related to something you were talking about towards the end, which is that in the conversation of technology and virtual production, we don't talk a lot about labor. And at the end of the day, the virtual production set is about a job. It's about multiple jobs being formed and lost. And what are those implications of working with people, having engineers on a set? What does that do to the conversations that need to exist? So I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the lessons you learned through your career about working across departments, talking to cinematographers, talking to lighting directors, talking to, you know, the director, and what that taught you about the collaborative nature of filmmaking.
That's a really good question, because it's very salient to the issues that come up if you try to do anything across the board that will lower the cost of production, which means lower employment, but it also means hopefully a better product. And for me, I work in the world of science fiction and space movies. You can't make them on this planet without building a lot of sets and a lot of locations and going to exotic planets and all kinds of other stuff. So that's kind of my stock and trade. It has nothing to do really with making a Western or making a love story or making a cop chase thriller movie or making any conventional movie. They're being made all day, every day by really good, competent filmmakers. So it only affects a certain segment of the industry, which Disney is now exploring massively with the Mandalorian, of using giant LED walls as their virtual set. I would liken the difference to be like trying to change coal mining into something else. It's totally different. It is so sophisticated. The electronics and the digital compositing and the real-time tracking and all the stuff you have to do to make a photorealistic digital environment for a movie is not easy. And you have to have quite a big crew of people at consoles with computers and you have to have this really cutting-edge technology to do it. So it's challenging, but it's thrilling in a way, because it's realizing the dreams of movies forever, because you can think of all kinds of movies that you probably know very well, like Casablanca or other, that go way back through movies where they had to rear project a movie behind someone driving a car or riding in a boat or whatever. And now it's gotten to where it's absolutely seamless, and it's fabulous, and it's convincing. And the new technologies are enabling what I like to do personally, which is space movies, and do it at a price that the world can afford, because everything is plummeting. It's been going down and down and down. The forces to drive down production costs are very relevant to what we're talking about. So if you can get a good result and make it photorealistic, you have an opportunity to make a movie. And you know, we're in a world now that's just so distinctly different from anything we've ever had before. We've got, how many thousand channels do you have on DirecTV or Dish or whatever? I mean, it's just thousands of channels that need to be filled with content. And so we've got this streaming revolution that's going on right now of everybody, Netflix and Hulu and Amazon and Disney Plus and everybody are streaming movies. And that's driving costs down because they want bulk movies. It's not like they really care about your movie. They just want a lot of movies to give a lot of opportunity for their subscribers to be able to get diversity of content. And so that's driving down production costs. But those movies are still largely conventional live action movies shot in Canada or the desert or whatever. I'm not going to talk about that.
Another question?
Is there a particular technique that excites you today, like other than modeling and Mandalorian? Is there a particular technique that excites you today, and like after all the pain that you had to go through to make just one frame, is there a technique now that you would still like to engage so painstakingly to actually?
Yeah, there are, and it has to do with this symposium and architecture too, because it just fits perfectly. It's that you know, I've been lucky enough to work with guys like Sid Mead on Blade Runner and things like that, a really wonderful futurist illustrator, visionary, and we need more of those.
Yeah.
Sid's unfortunately deceased, but there are some techniques that are emerging at our studio right now. I think we're pioneering stuff that no one else, even Disney, is doing yet, which is that you can now use high frame rates as a means of getting alternating frames that are either green or graphics. So it's alternating green, graphics, green, graphics, green, graphics. Because we're finding out that in order to get the ultimate result, you want to have plenty of post-production time to perfect the shot on a shot-by-shot basis. And if you're expecting, we're projecting images. We're not using an LED screen right now. Next week, I'm going to be experimenting with projecting digital 4K laser images on a hemispherical screen behind the actors, which is quite different from what anybody's trying. But we still have the option to go back in to that same shot and use the green screen behind them and finish the shot to an even higher level of finish that you could do in real time. So that's another thing that's very exciting, and that's going on right now, and it's very doable. Because you can, if you want to make an illusion in real time, that computer horsepower and that graphics engine better be top-notch. And even then, you have to give up something to get real time. You give up shaders, you give up luminosity, you give up various, there's various lighting techniques they use. And if you want the lighting to be better or more subtle or more graceful, or you want more geometry, or you want higher resolution texture maps, you can do it all in post-production. It's done every day. And then it allows you to improve on what you can do in real time, because you just give the computer more time to render. And you can do it with relatively inexpensive computers now. You don't need a big $1 million render farm. You can do it for 30,000.
So you're creating a reality and still leaving open the possibility for another reality or a better version of that reality to be dropped in.
Yeah. Yeah, and if you're trying to sell millions of dollars of real estate, it comes in handy in architecture.
Absolutely. Yeah. In the front here.
You talk a little bit about the interplay of aerospace technology and cinematography, and particularly in the context of flight simulation, which is effectively creating a virtual reality of its own. And I know from talking to you before that the technology moves in both directions. I was hoping you could address that further.
Yeah, it does. I mean, one of the big epiphanies I had a few years ago was being in a flight simulator and having a hemispherical screen wrapped all around the cockpit. And I was just blown away at how effective it was and how real it was. And even though I crashed a 747 short of the runway, it was really fun. And I didn't hurt anybody. So that's what led to the whole ride film idea and IMAX and having hemispherical screens like we did for the Back to the Future ride, which is basically a flight simulator. It's not a L-1011 or a DC-10 or whatever. It's a DeLorean car with 8 people in it. And there was 24 of those cars in this dome screens. And it's just a gas. So I found out that if you can emulate reality in an entertaining way, people just freak out. They just love it. They just absolutely are insatiable about it. And if you can fall short of making everybody barf, you're in good shape. So that's been a good business. It's dipped off now because the technology of it is so hardware driven,
right,
that the movie part of it is less. It's a big part of the budget, but it's not the budget. I've invented some motion bases and hydraulics and stuff that have been really fun to do, but they're not very satisfying for me creatively. But it can be done. I've got patents on really cool motion bases to where everybody feels exactly the same thing. You can imagine if you're in something that tips like this, but it's got 8 people in it, the person on the right is going up and the person on the left is going down. It's very hard to make a movie that satisfies both of those motions simultaneously. So I figured out how to do it really effectively. So the whole motion base never tips at all. It's just moving up and down and left and right and fore and aft with what's called vector cues. And everybody feels exactly the same thing. And I could go on and on about simulator rides. They're so much fun.
There's a historical piece to the question too, which is really interesting too, because we started at the very beginning talking about how your father worked on The Wizard of Oz and then went into aerospace and then, in fact, went back into special effects. And there's something very special about the place and time of California in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, where there is this interchange between the technologies and techniques of simulation and even of making real planes and then of making the illusion of these same things. And it seems like, do you feel like your own education and outlook would have been possible without that interchange?
No, not at all. I think that it was so interesting for me because I'm such a geek to watch what was going on during the Apollo program, for example, of Buzz Aldrin and what's his name? Neil Armstrong training in a simulator to land on the moon. And it was so good and so effective that they learned how to land on the moon and did it. And without the training, they never would have made it, would have crashed. So it's very powerful and it's also very entertaining. That's one of the weird things about it. It's not just about training pilots. It's about entertainment and a sense of kinesthetic physiological involvement that you're not going to get with a movie on a flat screen or in a theater where the seats don't move. So I've been pioneering all that stuff for years and years because it's just so much fun. It's just a gas.
There's a famous line quoted by David Mindell in his history of Digital Apollo that it was, quote unquote, very smooth, just like the simulators.
Right. So one of the things that brought us together was that thing that John Dykstra did in Berkeley, which was a driving simulator in an urban setting, which was like one of the first architectural applications of that technology to learning something about urban environments and streets and high-rise buildings and things like that.
For the sake of the audience, this is Donald Appleyard, who was I think he was actually Kevin Lynch's TA or RA for Image of the City, but he had become his faculty member and collaborator for A View from the Road, and then came to Berkeley, where he worked on a set of simulators around the same idea of visual information in the urban environment. John Dykstra, who was a protege of Doug's, was hired to build the technology, motion control technology for the simulators, and then use the same techniques in Star Wars. So it's the history of this interchange actually also extends to include our own discipline as well.
Yeah. And we got into that much more extensively when I did this big simulator attraction for the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, which was very similar to what John did for that, because we had a big gantry system. The camera was on a periscope lens, right, and it could traverse the whole stage at like 8 feet a second. And that's when we started figuring out how to do digital compositing of actors into miniatures with exactly matching perspective, fisheye lenses and everything else. So we had hemispheric screens. We had actors that we shot using robotic cameras and superimposed them into these miniatures, and it looked fabulous. So that was we learned a lot during those days, and IMAX made good money, but it was too complicated for a lot of people.
Well, this idea of a big mechanism that makes it all work is also particularly interesting to us when the mechanisms are now in software. But do we want to take a question from the online audience before we finish? Another question from someone in the room? Yeah, in the back.
You want to run any of this video, or
What?
You gonna run any of this video?
Oh no, we weren't able to set that up. So.
Okay.
I understand that in virtual production, most of the design is set up in advance and the props are prepared. Is it common during production for a director to say change his mind and like let's change this building or let's take this mountain to the right? And how often does that happen? And what happens when it happens? Is there an artist on set that changes real time, or?
Yes, there is more than one artist on set that changes the environment in real time, and the directors do change their mind all the time in real time. And we're getting into this really interesting new world because of LEDs. It's what sparked the whole thing, is that they're so bright and they're so photorealistically excellent that they can create reflections in glass and chrome and steel and cars. And so a lot of it's actually been driven by the automotive industry, sales of cars. I don't think there's one car on TV that's actually a real car. They're all synthetic computer-generated cars, but they're doing reflections in the windows, and the family's driving along, having a good time, and telling jokes and having bands in their car or whatever. So it's getting really good. So it's not just the image out the window, it's the images against the glass of the window and against the chrome and against the body molding of the car and everything. It's very sophisticated. I can't say much more about it than that, except that I've been working on hemispherical screens for a long time because of the ride things that I do. And so we're trying to adapt the hemispherical projected screen, like with 3 or 4 or 5 projectors, seamlessly blended onto a curved screen so that the cameraman can pan 180 degrees, which you can't on a flat LED wall. As soon as you go too far off, all the perspective lines start to converge in the wrong direction, and it becomes a nightmare. And so it's not as easy. It's not the silver bullet that people think it was, but it's effective, and it's the future of movies.
If you'd handed all these digital techniques to your 25-year-old self, what do you think he would have made of it?
That's a complicated question. because I'm not my 25-year-old self by any means. And, but I've been trying to do it for that long.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been on my mind for that long, for a long time. It's been for 30 years I've been after this digital world of being able to build, well, we call them transmedia, to make a ride or a movie or a television series or a feature film or anything you want using the same database. That's the magic of it, is being able to deploy all those assets of the mountains and the sky and the airplanes and whatever the movie's about in multiple markets to make it more efficient is very, very feasible now. They're not that organized yet. It takes a while because you have all these other market factors working against you, which is that if a studio hires a visual effects company to do all the visual effects for some movie, whatever it is, they're just as likely to not save all the assets. It's a real tragic thing, but it's slowly being solved. Companies like Weta Digital are really saving. Because Peter Jackson is much smarter than that. And if you don't save the assets, then you're starting from scratch the next time you want to do the sequel or the whatever, or the ride. So people are getting smarter about it now, and they're starting to save them and archive them and reuse them.
Well, maybe Caroline, you can ask the last.
Worthy of a culminating question.
Yeah.
But do you have an opinion about metahumans?
I'm working on it. Actually, I need a whole bunch of them.
You need a whole bunch of metahumans?
Yes.
Yeah. So, you know, game engines have invented synthetic actors. So this goes back to the question of labor. What do you want to do with the metahumans in your projects?
I'm going to make aliens. I'll be that revealing. I don't want to remake Marilyn Monroe or anybody else. I mean, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on out there where they're trying to replace dead actors and actresses. And I just think it's a snafu idea. But yeah, it has tremendous potential, and it's.
So you'd like to make.
There was a talk, about deepfakes, and that was really interesting.
So you'd like to make meta non-humans, meta more than humans.
Superhumans, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I think that's okay.
Yeah.
That's non-toxic.
Yeah. Maybe that's a perfect place. Do you have?
Yeah, she does.
No words from the metaverse? Yeah. Okay.
Well, there's so much about storytelling that has changed in the last 60 years over the course of your career, but there are some fundamental things about light and the eye and perception and the creation of reality that have not. And so to the extent that we've been able to enjoy both of those things, understanding both of those things in our conversations with you, Doug, I thank you so much on behalf of all of us.
Thank you very much.
And here at MIT and out in the rest of the world as well.
This is fun. Thank you. Thank you.
So we have that little clip that Dennis made of the interview, and maybe we could just play that as an outro if you guys have that in your. Let me also just take a moment to thank these amazing MIT film and video producers that we have in the back of the room. They've had a long day.
We see the world as a panorama all the time. That's our natural state. I can see my hands right now. I can't count my fingers because the resolution's not very good, but I know they're there. I like to work with this immersive, panoramic, experiential imagery. And it started with me, the first film I ever worked on was at Graphic Films in Hollywood, which was To the Moon and Beyond for the New York World's Fair in 1964, which was shot in this unusual fisheye, 10 perforation, 70 millimeter film process and projected into a planetarium dome. And Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke saw that film at the expo and called Graphic Films and said, we want to make this movie which became titled 2001: A Space Odyssey. And we started doing pre-production. When I first arrived at the movie I was already progressing. I was kind of coming on a little bit late. And the Centrifuge was under construction, the pod bay was under construction, all the sets were under construction. And here I am, this 23-year-old kid from LA with cowboy boots and a cowboy hat, which was kind of my look at the time. And they thought this was all just terribly cute. And I had just total freedom, which was part of the magic of being able to do what I wanted to do. And I was always having crazy ideas. And so I could just go over to the wood shop and say, well, could you guys make me a piece of plywood with a hole in it that will rotate? I'm going to mount this thing on it, and I'm going to be able to turn it to a bunch of different positions at an angle in an X-ray machine downtown London. And they said, oh yeah, fine, whatever, Doug, I'll have it for you later. And so they would build things for me, and then I would be dispatched to the X-ray company in London in Stanley Kubrick's private Bentley. And everybody thought, well, whatever, And I thought, well, this is amazing, but that was kind of my life at that time. It was just having this incredible freedom to cross all boundaries and think laterally in many different ways and do a lot of very unusual things. And it's that kind of, the art form, the interface between visual arts and mechanical arts is my strength. And I don't find it very often, but it's what the best visual effects people can do. The world that we see, I see you, I see him, I see this room, arrives through the lenses of my eyes and arrives at the retinas of my eyes, upside down and backwards. And those two images are sent electrochemically into my visual cortex. The only place the image of you that exists for me is on my retina. You're not really there. I think you're there. I project you to be there because it all matches up. I can correct what I think I see with what I believe I see. I've kind of gotten to this existential feeling about human perception that it's possible to put images onto the retina of one's eyes that are indistinguishable from reality.